welcome back to Exeter and Lara. You're watching episode 2 of Back to the Style of It All series, and in this video I'm going to be showing you some simple, straightforward weathering. So understandably, a fair few people don't really have the confidence in making any sort of start on weathering, so I thought I'd show you the principle of what I do for something that's simple and basic that anybody could pick up a wagon, piece of rolling stock or even a locomotive and have a go at it themselves. As I've got two different types of wagon here, one of them being a ore wagon as this one, and this one here which is a box vent van, you're going to get two different styles of weathering on both of these, as this one here would be constructed from metal, so it's going to prone to have more rust and faded paintwork on it, whereas this one would just generally be possibly faded, but to match with the steam era, which is what this would have been sort of in and around, it would have a lot more in the way of the grime and stuff like that on there. So what I'm going to do is show you something simple that could potentially take about 5 minutes to actually weather this, using the various weathering products that I use. So as always, I'll start off with talking through the products that I use, as I will do in every single video that I do, so people become familiar of what is the best products to use out there. Obviously some people have their different preferences, but I use Humbrol's weather products, as I find that they're quite good. Their weathering powders are already mixed up in a pot. You get a variety of different colours, and making sure, as always with all weathering powders, is to make sure that you always mix up all different shades to try and keep things prototypical, so you haven't got a uniform colour. So that one on this tray is a mixture of everything, as shown in previous videos. Is what I call my muddy shade of grey, which is my typical kind of track grime colour or general weathering. I also tend to use a lot of the dark earth and rust mixtures. Sometimes I will add a bit of red oxide weathering powder colour in with that as well, just to add a bit more of a visual interest. I also use, I normally use matte coat varnish, but unfortunately at the moment I don't actually have any matte coat varnish, so I'm just going to use the gloss coat, which isn't a problem, as everything, once the weathering powders and everything else are all on, the finish coat will be sprayed with a matte varnish. Now I tend to use an airbrush to seal up all of my work, but for anybody who doesn't have an airbrush, you can still go into a hobby shop and buy acrylic. You can normally buy these type of sprays in matte varnishes, and they're about £5 a can, and it will save you the bother of having to go out and get yourself an airbrush plus all the varnishes that you need to go in it. I'll also use a mixture of different types of brushes. I have a variety of all sorts, from just flat tipped ones to round head ones, and I don't necessarily go out and buy expensive brushes, as the quality of them aren't as good as you kind of expect to pay for. So one of the main important brushes that I use is a dry one, which is extremely soft, and that comes in handy for brushing off loose weathering powders. So it's always good to have one of those and use it as just your dusting brush. So I've got myself ready, and I'm going to make a start on the iron ore wagon first, as I want to be able to do the inside of this. As it's metal, it's going to be pretty well worn and battered and bashed around, so it's probably, generally in real life, you're probably never going to see the fact that it's grey inside, which matches the outside. So I'm going to rust up the inside of this and leave it in a complete coating of rust. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with giving this a coat of the gloss varnish all inside, and as always you can just use matte varnish or any other type of varnish. It doesn't matter at this stage what it is. Also as well, I aim to just go across the top of this. And once that's had a coat on there, I'm going to put that aside for about 5 minutes just to allow that varnish to start to go off. Okay, so giving that a bit of time to dry. It's still a bit wet in places, but that's perfectly fine. Now, when it comes for using the weathering powders, I make sure that any brush that I use is specifically set aside for that particular colour that I'm using. So I've already set aside, got the dark earth, rust colour and the red oxide, and what I'm going to do is just blend the 3 colours in the middle, but keeping each individual colour around the outside, so I've still got the selection to make if I need to just use one particular shade. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to completely fill the inside of this wagon. You get the idea. What I'll do is I'll finish that off and then I'll come back in once. Okay, so that's kind of what you're aiming to get. And I've gone across the top, just in individual places, as I think that maybe there could still have been some paint still on top of the around the this part of the wagon, around the top edges. Okay, so going on to the outside of it, what I've done is I've tipped a little bit of the varnish on a piece of plywood, and I've got the rust and the dark earth. And what I'm going to do is just get some of the varnish through the middle, and then just mix up a kind of a mixture of the various shades. Now this, depending on how grubby you actually want this, depends on how much that you actually want to apply to the sides. So this is just the principle of just coating up the sides on here as so. And this is one of the full advantages of really using the weathering powders, because you don't have to keep constantly changing from one pot of acrylic paint to another. You've got those tones right in front of you. So if you do this all the way around, then leave it for, I suppose by the time you've gone all the way around, this should be dry enough to carry on with the next stage. Okay, so gone all the way round, and as I said, it doesn't matter at this stage how much you actually put on. And even already it's beginning to look the part. So I've cleaned my brush out and put all the weathering powders to the side, and what I'm going to do is go back into the gloss varnish and basically reactivate what I've already put on. And this is where you can now create the rust streaks. And you can clean away as much as you can. Remember, if you're doing rust streaks, keep them as vertical as you possibly can. And it's as simple as that. And you've got nicely rusted with plenty of streaks on there. So I'm going to do that all the way around, and then I'm going to leave that to dry for probably about 20-25 minutes. Okay, so whilst the other wagon's drying, I've made a start on the box van, and what I've done is just diluted some white weathering powder with some of the gloss varnish, and given the roof a very wishy-washy coat of that, and I'll also be doing the sides with the same as well. So I'm just going to finish off this side. Again, it all doesn't matter how neat and tidy it is at this stage. And by the time you've probably done the roof and the two sides, and I tend to leave these sides as they are and come back to those a little bit later, because you've literally got nowhere to hold. So I'm just going to remove any obvious bits that don't look quite right and just fan my brush over the roof. Until I'm happy with that. Now, as these box vans would have been used in the steam era, this is where you might want to blend some black colours as well to represent the soot that you get from steam locos and stuff like that. I won't do black indoors because, or in the kitchen anyway, because black powder tends to get everywhere, and as soon as you wipe the table, one granule of that black weathering powder makes an awful mess. So I'm just going to stick with this shade of grey, and what I'm going to do is just dab this over the roof. Make sure that the varnish is sticky and not wet. And you've got to make sure that you work all the powders all the way in so you have no lumps. If you get the idea, you can just add more to the sides. Or if you feel a bit adventurous, you can flick it off the side so it flicks it up the roof. As I say, if this is at the beginning of the rake of wagons and right next to the steam loco, then add a lot more black to the roof, and it kind of makes it less uniform. So now I've done that part, what I'm going to do is I'm going to rework the weathering on the sides, and this is where I go into thinners. And again, with thinners, just always be careful with any decals that you have, numbers and stuff on any of locos rolling stock, as thinners can be potentially quite brutal. What I'm going to do is just work the weathering mixture into all of the gaps of the timber. Until you end up with something like that. And to finish this off, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back into the muddy shade of grey, and I'm going to just flick a nice amount off the bottom of the wagon so it flicks it up the body sides. And of course you can always flick off the top of the roof and flick it downwards as well. Okay, so what I've done is I've also just added a bit more weathering powder in the dark brown and rust colours just over the metalwork. And what I'm going to do is just load up a nice fine tip brush with some thinners, and I'm just going to set those rust tones in by just dabbing the thinners specifically on those rust powders, and that way it works it into where it needs to be, rather than it just being a loose powder, and by the time you spray the varnish over it you'll end up losing all the rust. So try and get a close-up of that. So on this wagon only, I'll just show you how I quickly deal with the undersides of this. Now I always start off with a white base coat on anything underneath, and I will coat up all of this, as if you use a white base coat it makes everything else that goes on top of this stand out a lot more. So just coat up all these bits of detail. You can do the wheels if you feel like it. Stick a bit on them. And then what I'm going to do is just give that a few seconds to dry, about a minute, two, something like that, just so it goes sticky. Okay, so that's still a little bit too wet, but it'll do at this stage. And I'm just going to use the grime, dirty shade of grey, whatever you want to call it, over here. I'm going to switch from that and I'm going to go into rust. Just picking out various bits of detail with some of the rust colours. And that again just adds that bit of visual interest and stops things from being too uniform. Again, just put that aside, let it to dry. And as with anything that has a metal body to it, you're going to see to some degree some form of faded paintwork. So I'm just going to use a very small round stubbing on brush and just stub on some white weathering powders in various places. And this is where I mentioned at the beginning, with a nice soft dusting off brush, that you do just brush them down and you'll end up with that brush just setting those powders in just enough. And again, once that's all dried, give the whole thing a quick spray over again to finalise, make sure that everything is all locked in. And there we have it. That's the finished result. As you can see, you've got one which is covered in rust and just general grime on the box one. Obviously these were done quickly, probably took me no more than about 10 minutes each wagon to do. There is more detail that you can add to these. You can pick out darker spots of rust by just using a bit of the dark earth mixture with a bit of varnish, and just use a fine brush just to kind of dab various areas where you might have a bit heavy rust on the end of a drip. So as always, hopefully you find the videos useful and encourage people to have a go at weathering. If you've got any questions, please do ask. Any comments, likes, click away, and hopefully it'll be nice to see some people with weathered wagons on their layout. So as always, I'll be back again with another episode on this series. Not quite sure what's due up yet, but got plenty of ideas. So thanks for now, and I'll see you all soon.